Welcome to 18th Century Cooking. I'm your host, John Townsend, and today we're going to be baking something that you could use for a holiday treat so special. These are little tartlets, right from the 18th century cookbooks. Thanks for joining us today as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century. So today's recipe comes from the lady's assistant, Charlotte Mason. And we've been using this cookbook a lot. It's a really a good cookbook. This one's from 1777, this particular edition. Tartlets. Have a very small and shallow tin pans, butter them, lay in a bit of puff paste, we'll talk about that later, marking it neatly around the edges, leave a hole in the middle, bake them. When they are cool, fill them with custard or put into each half an apricot, raspberry jam or other preserved fruit, a little preserved apple or marmalade, pour over it custard with a very little sugar in it. And also at the bottom here, icing for tarts. Beat the white of an egg, rub it on the tarts with a feather, sift over it double refined sugar. So we're gonna be making these very small little tartlets. Again, they're almost like hors d'oeuvres, right? They're just little single serving pieces, and that means we can have all kinds of fun. We can make all sorts of different types. Before we get started on our tart tins, before we start putting the paste in, let's talk about this paste for just a second. She calls for puff paste. And now today, you and I can go to the grocery store and we can buy a box of puff paste. And in fact, I recommend it. It is great stuff. The problem is it's not the same puff paste that she's talking about in here. She actually has a direction for puff paste. Rub as much butter into some flour as possible without it feeling all greasy. It must be rubbed in quite fine. Put water in it to make it a nice light paste. Roll it out, stick bits of butter all over it, flour it, roll it up again. Do this 3 times. Today's puff paste probably has been, rolled over with layers, a dozen times or 20 times for all I know. It's made in a very industrial process, and they can do it over and over and over again. Somebody in the 18th century who's making their own puff paste is not going to do that. So it doesn't have as many layers of butter, and it doesn't puff up as much as today's puff paste. If we use today's puff paste in this little tin, it would crawl right out of the tin and it wouldn't be useful to us at all. So we're going to be using the short crust, and in the short crust recipe, she says this is the one that you will use for all tarts. So even though the tartlet recipe says use puff paste, in the short crust recipe, she says this is the one you want to use for all the tarts. So short crust is what we are going to use. So let's cut out some little circles a little bit bigger than our tart tin. Probably, almost a ½ inch bigger than what that tart tin looks like. Because it's got to fold up and go down into the bottom. So we'll just start with this one to see how it works out before we get going too much farther. We're going to butter our tin first. And I'm going to be generous with that because we want these to pop right out so that we can serve them up. We're just going to sort of fold this up a little bit. I'll even get it into a kind of a cup shaped before I get started. Send that down in there. And I'm not going to worry that I have a little bit too much around the outside because this stuff shrinks down a lot, more than you might want. So I'm actually going to just flange the top of it almost out and leave that. There we go. So there, that one looks pretty good. We can bake this up before we put the contents in it. So we'll start with one like that. That was a good size. To hold this down, because we're baking these empty, we're gonna actually add some beans inside of here. Nice dry beans that we can pour out later. They'll help hold the shape. And then we're gonna try a little bit of this frosting before they go in the oven. A little bit of egg white that's been whipped up just enough to make it so it isn't stringy. And then we're gonna add a little bit of sugar to the top of that. So now they go right into the oven at 450 degrees for, say, 12 or 15 minutes. You'll need to watch them and see what they're doing in your oven. Now our recipe gives us all sorts of different ways we can put the fillings in, and she's really calling for sweetmeats of the time period. Some recipes would just say put sweetmeats in here. So we've got things like jams, marmalades, different kinds of dried fruits. So apricots she calls for, dates. You could use other ones at the same time. Any sweet item that you could put in here, and then to kind of balance that, you don't want just sweet. We've got the balance of the nice cool custard that's in there at the same time. And really, if you really want the last little beautiful sprinkle, you could put cinnamon on top, or even better, a little nutmeg sprinkled up on top, and they are beautiful. Let's go ahead and try one of these out. I've got one of these that has the glazing, it's got the custard on top, and then it's got a wonderful strawberry preserve underneath. Again, this is a perfect opportunity to use some preserves. Let's find out. I know, you're saying, oh, this is gonna taste horrible, John, right? The crust was perfect. Not baked too much. Again, wonderful sweetness of the preserves underneath. The amazing lightness of the custard up on top. They really go together well. Again, with a little bit of nutmeg. So, so good. Now, if you're interested in the pie crust, it's like, John, how did you make the crust? Go back to the apple pie episode we did just a few weeks ago. And I did just a very, very simple short crust for that. And for the custard, way back a year or two ago, we did a wonderful apple pie with a custard filling, almost exactly the same thing. So there we talk about the custard, so check that out. Whew, this one is really good and so beautiful and perfect for the holidays. You have guests over, you want to beautify your table, and you've got all these things. You can do these. They're so decorative as well as being so very wonderful.